Hello, this is the second of two videos on the topic, what is rock music and is it dead? Although it's not necessary to enjoy this video, please watch part 1 where I go into lots of very interesting stuff about what makes rock music rock. It's obviously a very broad topic, so I can't pretend to have covered it definitively, but the gist of it is, from a music kind of point of view, rock music is all about power chords, played on electric guitars, loudly through an electric amp. Except when it isn't. You see, genres are very complicated, and that's what this part is largely about. Any sort of generic criteria are ultimately going to fall short of reality, especially if we're just looking at music theory and broader technical elements. There are always going to be complications, contradictions, and exceptions. All music is far deeper, far more interesting, and more complicated than just the music theory, which is already deep, interesting, and complicated enough, right? And that's because genre is all about, well, it is about all the theory and nerdy stuff, but it's also about style and fashion and language and values and humor and storytelling and tragedy, horror, love, romance, just all that straightforwardly human stuff. Each genre approaches all that stuff in its own way and according to its own standard. And that's simply because different genres aren't just different ways to make aesthetically pleasing noise, they're different cultures. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that music theory and broader cultural values are entirely separate things. In fact, it's partly because genres have their own unique cultures that they can and do make their own aesthetically pleasing noises in their own way. The theoretical and technical side has an inextricably close relationship with all that fluffy social cultural stuff. But, well, I guess I'm just saying that we don't want to reduce conversations about genre or music generally or any art to just the theoretical stuff, music theory, and ignore the wider context, like some people do. So there's actually already an excellent YouTube video out there on this general topic. It's called What is Genre? Oh, wait, what? It's one of my videos. What a coincidence. Anyway, in that fantastic video, the very handsome and cool YouTuber points out how musical genre isn't just the bits that you can describe theoretically or write down in music notation. It's cultural and societal things too, and that is true of any genre and any art form. So I'll be a bit more specific. Let's start with something simple like vocal style and accent. Accent isn't necessarily the most obvious generic signifier in music, but it kind of actually is. Each genre has its own standards and expectations of how a vocalist should sound, as in literally how they pronounce words and what accent they use. If you produce, for example, a trap song and you rap in a received pronunciation accent, people will assume you're being satirical or mocking or self-effacing or something like that.
I don't know what you're talking about, but it sounds damn saucy, you lucky thing.
I'm sure just by doing it in that accent, a lot of people wouldn't even consider it trap. And then you have something like opera singers who are trained very intensively to make sure that they're enunciating words very specifically. You can't sing Handel with a Brummie accent without it sounding a little bit weird. Although I would like to hear that. And now, looking just at rock music, the first few generations of British rock musicians very rarely sang with their British accents, and even more in their actual, provincial British accents. Those guys, and they were all guys, we'll get back to this a bit later on, those guys all sang with either full-blown fake American accents or just highly Americanized accents. Why was that? Were they unhappy or ashamed of the way they spoke?
You sound like you're from London.
No, well, okay, maybe that was part of it. You see, those early British rock acts all grew up on American blues, rock and roll, jazz, soul, and as far as they knew, popular music, the good stuff that they wanted to emulate, had to be sang in an American accent and not with British accents, whether that's London accents or Scouse or Brummie or Glaswegian or Welsh valleys. These early rock musicians literally learned their craft by staying up late at night and working out how to play songs they heard on the radio that almost exclusively had American accents in. So based solely on that, it should come as no surprise to hear at times slightly ridiculous American accents from plenty of non-Americans. Elton John, Mick Jagger, Robert Plant, Joe Cocker, Bon Scott.
I'm so carefree.
All those letters every day, maybe.
I said, baby.
The poorhouse, they hit me for my
And then more subtle but still clearly Americanized accents in the Beatles, Deep Purple, Thin Lizzy, many more.
She's got a ticket to ride, and she don't care. Nobody gonna take my girl, I'm gonna keep her to the end. Somewhere on the waterfront, Johnny's hiding with a gun.
There were exceptions, of course. I think Pink Floyd and the Kinks are the most obvious. We're talking about like classic rock.
Overhead, the albatross hangs motionless.
They seek him here, they seek him there.
But even they mixed more obviously British accents with American sounding accents.
You awake with a start, just the beating of your...
Then you have the whole scene of prog rock, which I think tended to stick to their accents a lot more consistently. But even there, you had exceptions. Like Greg Lake sounds very English, whereas John Wetton tends to sound a little bit more American. Peter Hamill, very British. Peter Gabriel, a little bit more American, but, you know, kind of on the borderline. And then there's John Anderson, who sounds... I don't know what he sounds like. Anyway, it was in the mid-70s with punk that everything just completely changed. None of those punk musicians seemed particularly bothered about pretending to sound anything other than very British. France and Germany and other European countries and South America, basically non-English speaking world as a whole, each area had their own unique relationship with how to sing and play what was ultimately an American-born genre. Some bands stuck to their native tongue. Some made up weird alien languages. And some satirized the fact that you could sing any old nonsense as long as it sounded like American English and it would sell. And today, well, now I think it's very normal for British rock bands and rock bands all over the world to sing with whatever their natural accents are. The Arctic Monkeys, for example, sound obviously British on most of their stuff. Friend of the show, Jonathan Higgs from Everything Everything, doesn't pretend to be American at all. And I mean, I could go on, right? None of them really go for that over-the-top Elton John or Jagger-esque American twang. And if they did, I think today we wouldn't take it seriously. It would sound corny as hell. Looking more broadly at popular music as a whole, there is still a bit more of a tendency to default to Americanized accents on the more soulful side of things. Adele and someone like Lewis Capaldi, I think, do it a bit. Amy Winehouse did too, but it's nowhere near prevalent now as it once was. Ultimately, though, all this accent stuff is still directly related to the music itself, isn't it? It's a big component of vocal timbre and, you know, you can just hear it. So let's take what I'm talking about a little bit further. Let's look at things that aren't immediately, like, inherent in the music, at least not in the way that you can hear when listening to a rock song. So let's talk about generic values. That is, the values of rock music and the people who listen to it. Again, I don't just mean the musical values, but the broader social values that do, of course, impact the music, but aren't the music itself. If you get what I mean. Do I get what I mean? Let's see. So here are some of these values. Big disclaimer though, just to be clear, I'm not trying to be prescriptive here. I'm trying to be a bit more descriptive. Nor am I saying that other genres don't value these things, or that rock values them first, or that all rock musicians value them, or that it's a good thing to value these things, or that it's bad. Some of these are stereotypes that today are a little bit outdated or even potentially a bit offensive, but I'm not endorsing them. Fill in your own little disclaimer here. The point is, it's not me agreeing with these sometimes merely purported values. Given all that, here we go. Just some of what I think are rock music's cultural values. So we have authenticity, anti-establishment, fun and exciting rather than usually serious or austere, broadly anti or unacademic, youth-oriented, individualist. And three that might seem a little controversial on the face of it, but we have to be honest about the history of rock music. And again, I am not endorsing these as prescriptive values, but rock music has historically been, and today to a large extent still is, predominantly male-dominated. At times aggressively heterosexual.
It's about Paul Stanley's dick. How this girl's gonna get some of his dick.
And very white. And none of these things are trivial. They have real impact on what the music sounds like, what the music is about, what it isn't about, how we listen to it, who listens to it. For one, the fact that rock music, while at its commercial peak, and still a lot today, has mainly been a straight white guy genre is precisely why we have song after song after song after song about sexy women that singers want to bed.
I said, hey, what's your name, baby? Maybe we can set this on fire.
The lyrical and musical cliches used in these songs are pretty much baked into rock music. Decade to decade, they reappear in much the same form. It's much less common to hear popular rock songs about sexually aggressive women going after men, or men after men, or women after women. When songs like that are written, they're almost inherently and invariably conscious subversions of rock's mainstream tropes. Anyway, all of these values are, of course, contradicted at points by plenty of rock bands that are no less rock simply because they don't fit the image or the stereotype. And you know, it's not the 70s anymore, thank God, so these values aren't as important as they once were. They're applied inconsistently, haphazardly, or even hypocritically. Take authenticity. In terms of the purported values of rock music, I think it's one of the big ones. Rock music, supposedly all about real playing, real singing, real attitudes. It's frowned upon to use autotune, for example, and in a rock band, you're supposed to play the instruments yourself, preferably write the music yourself, and it's unpretentious, unschooled, straightforward. Like the Rolling Stones, they're authentic, right? Straight down the line rock and roll, except for the whole affected, almost frankly tacky, obviously fake American accents and songs about American life and history with a focus on Black American culture. Like, how is that real, really, when it comes to it? From a bunch of middle-class white guys from London? Okay, so maybe they're not a great example. What about Creedence Clearwater Revival, an American rock band singing about America in an American idiom with American accents? This, then, is straightforward, no-nonsense, bluesy roots rock, except that they were all Californian, sang about the bayou, the South, and the Mississippi. Is that entirely authentic? I mean, it's clearly not, but that doesn't seem to negatively impact their rock reputation. And it obviously shouldn't, because that's not the kind of authenticity that we rock fans care about. So, what even is authenticity? It's a topic that probably needs a video entirely to itself, but suffice to say, it certainly isn't just one thing that we can all easily point to and agree on and say, yes, that is authenticity. It means different things to different people and in different genres. So, the question should be, how is rock authentic? After all, rock fans do make big claims about its authenticity, particularly in comparison to pop music. And it's always been a big part of how rock music is seen by fans, by journalists, particularly when it comes to defining what is good and what is bad and what is real and what is not real rock music. Pop music is fake, rock music is real. Therefore, according to this, quite often, pop music is bad and rock music is good. So, firstly, these standards around authenticity in rock are not all-encompassing. That is, you can be very inauthentic in some ways, like a British band singing in an American accent about the Deep South, but, and this is the important bit, you do need to be authentic in the ways that rock music defines authenticity. Now, rock music is broad enough that what counts as authentic varies a bit, subgenre to subgenre, decade to decade. That's why someone can think of a band like The Clash are very authentic, but post-American Idiot Green Day are definitely not. Both are, broadly speaking, rock. Both are punk too, and both play very political, uncomplicated, catchy music. But they're different enough that millions of people might really like one while actually quite disliking the other. Like me, for example. The whole issue of selling out is all wrapped up in all this, but I'm not going to get into that here. It's enough to say right now that selling out or not selling out is very important in rock music. It's a really famous just cliche, we've all heard it before. So, there are three main implicit and actually quite often explicit rules that I think apply to pretty much all types of rock music regarding authenticity, whether we're talking about punk, grunge, roots rock, blues rock, psychedelic, or whatever. The general expectation of rock musicians are that they, A, play their own instruments, 2, can play live, and C are primarily self-taught as musicians. So let's look at them one by one. Rock musicians play their own instruments. Rock musicians do not rely on session musicians. They play their own songs themselves. And they do not lean on studio trickery to fix their mistakes. They don't need to. In fact, leaving mistakes in when they do occur is even more rock and roll than anything else. Now, rock bands can certainly, of course, use session or outside musicians if they need some strings or keys, extra vocals or anything like that. But if the band members aren't playing the bulk of the music, they're not rock, almost by definition. Take the Monkees, for example. They're kind of pop rock, really, I guess. Their music in and of itself isn't too far away from that of the Beatles at all. But where the Beatles are a rock band, the Monkees, generally speaking, are not seen that way. They're a pop band, or, maybe more accurately, a fake rock band. And that difference comes down mostly, I mean, there are a few bits to it, but mostly down to the fact that the Beatles played their own instruments and wrote their own songs. Now, the Monkees did occasionally actually write their own songs, and they could play their own instruments to some degree. And they could certainly sing, but they mostly did not write their own music or play most of their instruments in the studio. And that division exists up to today. Something can sound like a rock song, but might not be accepted as one if recorded by a manufactured pop band, or if put together using samples or programmed instruments. They would essentially be adorning themselves in the aesthetic of rock music without really being real enough to be rock music. Also worth saying that it doesn't matter if a band just can't play their instruments particularly well. I mean, if they suck enough, then they can't be expected to play prog or maths rock or jazz rock, really. But they're still rock generally. Lots of punk and grunge and garage rock really revels in sloppy playing. But the key thing is that a rock band plays their instruments. Anything else is inauthentic and fake, after all. Rock musicians can play live. A rock musician who can't or won't play live in front of an audience is a poor rock musician indeed. It's one thing to be able to nail that solo in the studio where you might be sitting down and where you can just try again and again and again until you nail the tricky part.
The first one starts on the open, the second one starts on this one,
Yeah.
and then the third one starts on that one.
Yeah, I got that. It's
Okay.
the notes in between are fucking with me.
But it's another thing entirely to get it right night after night on a grueling tour. Although actually getting it right is a potentially misleading way to put it. Rock bands don't need to play right in the sense of accurately and consistently. This isn't classical music. There's no sheet music to tell you what has to be played. In fact, a performance can be quite sloppy, but it as a whole needs to feel right, and that's the important bit. Part of that is playing to generic expectations correctly. In rock music, though, playing something right in a live environment mostly means being a dynamic, interesting performer with stage presence. It means putting on a show. And that's not easy at all. It's why loads of rock bands, when playing on the old British music TV series Top the Pops, would refuse to mime along with recordings of their songs. I think Nirvana did it the most famously.
Load up on drugs, kill your friends.
It's just not rock and roll at all to go up there and mime along with your own song. That's for pop musicians. Ugh. I think a useful way to frame this is to think about the term bedroom pop. This is pop music made by home-based artists working largely by themselves who probably upload their music online and are at the very least self-published. We all get that, right? That makes sense to us. But is there such a thing as bedroom rock? Well, I mean, I guess there must be. Yeah, there definitely is. There are loads of rock musicians doing this today, and it's a perfectly legitimate way to be a musician, but it's not really a mainstream generic term that you'll hear often. You might hear bedroom guitarist, but I think that's a much more pejorative term than bedroom pop. And that's linked, I think, to what I'm talking about here. A bedroom guitarist playing rock music is doing something quite unrock, playing in their bedroom, no audience. Not right, not rock. Writing pop songs and recording them by yourself in your bedroom, well, that's okay, because it's pop. But you can't really have bedroom rock, even if plenty of rock musicians exist in the same way as bedroom pop. Bedroom rock guys at least have to pretend to be otherwise, right? Rock musicians are mostly self-taught. Finally then, rock musicians learn how to play their instruments themselves, i.e. primarily outside of formal education, what some people call self-taught, though I'm not necessarily so keen on the term. I've talked a little bit about this in part 1, so I don't want to go over the same ground again, but the general point is rock music isn't really an academic genre. It's not got the few hundred years of history of formal pedagogy like the classical tradition. You don't need to know how to read music, you don't need music grades, you don't even need to know what a musical key is or what a scale is necessarily. There are rock schools today, but they're not really on the same sort of footing as a jazz school. Even a decidedly unacademic genre like folk has a stronger inherent intellectual bent to it with its links to history and politics and its more often serious tone. Now, that isn't at all to say that to play rock music you can't do these things or know about them or whatever. Rock music isn't inherently anti-intellectual, although I think some subgenres do have their anti-intellectual tendencies. And of course, you can have a music teacher and you don't have to be 100% self-taught, whatever that means. But nonetheless, rock music remains a less academic, less formally taught genre, at least than jazz and classical. I think the best way to put it is this: although you can obviously learn rock music and related genres today in more formal academic settings, I can't think of any actually famous rock bands that were taught rock music in an academic setting. The mere idea of that sounds a little bit weird, a little bit unrock. Sure, there are rock bands where certain members went to music school, but they didn't learn rock music there. They were learning jazz or classical before they usually, let's be honest, flunked out and started playing rock. And look, I'm sure someone will come to me with an exception or exceptions, but it's rare. It's very rare. Anyway, you will notice that I've not talked very much in this video or the first about rock vocabulary, as in the literal notes that rock musicians play and how they play them. Chords, scales, rhythms, and meter and all that. It's obviously pretty important and there is lots to be said on it, but rock music I think is varied enough that there's little I could say that would apply to the whole genre. Sure, pentatonic scales and blues progressions are important for classic rock bands. Everyone from Led Zepp to AC/DC, Queen, Lynyrd Skynyrd, virtually every other 70s rock group. But they're much less important to talk about once we're in the world of progressive rock or neoclassical metal or noise rock or artists like Frank Zappa, Henry Cow, you know, the weirdos of the rock world. It's important stuff then, but it's not what I wanted to focus on in these videos. So, I've obviously not covered everything about rock, but that was never going to be possible. And in fact, my point, which I might be repeating a lot now, my point is exactly that. Like any genre, rock can't just be reduced down to an analysis of the music theory. There's far more to it. It's almost like an anthropological study type thing, and it would take a lot of work to really go through it in detail. All I can really do in the time that I have in these videos is kind of point to it, vaguely gesture at it all, and make some general statements alongside my usual bad jokes. After all, rock music has been around for like, what, 60, 70 years? That's 70-ish years of communities starting up, living, then dying, 70 years of changing trends, language, visual arts, humor, storytelling, and of course, the music itself. There's no chance of anyone wrapping it all up with a neat little bow and going, see that? That is what rock is, no more and no less. So, anyway, after all that is said and done, I have to wonder, what is the point of talking about what rock is or isn't when it's dead anyway? Isn't this just a drawn-out post-mortem of a now irrelevant genre? And if it is, what might I conclude as the cause of death? Well, let's answer that question in detail in a bit. But first I'll give my, some might say, slightly glib, immediate answer. And that is, it doesn't really matter and you shouldn't care. Get over it. Touch grass. Chill out. Get some perspective and spend your time worrying about things that are a little bit more important. Okay, I can't tell you what to care about and I probably shouldn't insult you, but you shouldn't worry, and I do genuinely mean it when I say that it's not that important and we should try to maintain some perspective when we talk about decline of a genre. Let us just, for a second, zoom out from our narrow little vantage point in time and space. The here and now. Modern humans have existed for around 300,000 years, and what we think of as civilization has been here for around 6,000 years. There are billions of us alive right now. And according to what I just spent 20 seconds researching on Google, around 117 billion humans have lived in total. Think of all the music that they made and listened to, all the art that they produced and appreciated and hated and loved, all the languages they spoke, all the conversations they had, all the stories and the jokes too, all the cultures that once existed and now are just gone.
Like tears in rain.
And just think about what the state of humanity and this planet might be in another 500 or 1,000 or 38,000 years. How all the stories we tell and the jokes we laugh at, the music we listen to, it might just be completely forgotten about or looked at as quaint little period pieces or just the beginning of something very different or more important. Or maybe no one will be here to think anything of it at all. Nothing lasts forever, and that's okay. But before you think I'm just getting all existential and nihilistic on you, I'm not really, or at least that isn't my point. What I'm trying to say is that tons of genres and ways of making art and communicating generally that were once considered very important by the people who made and enjoyed them, they're all gone and we're fine. We're okay. Our art is sufficiently rich and interesting and emotive. It simply isn't a big deal that we no longer, for example, write plays like Shakespeare did, or, to take it back further, write plays like Sophocles. Ancient Greek, Renaissance, and early modern ways of writing for the theatre are essentially dead. Sure, we might put on those plays and they're continually reinterpreted, but the specific way that Shakespeare wrote is basically a dead art today. And that's okay. It doesn't diminish the quality of his art, and it certainly doesn't diminish the quality of our art. I think a lot of the concern about rock music dying comes from the misplaced notion that if rock music dies, live music dies, or authentic music dies. Those rock values that I talked about earlier are assumed by many to only be exemplified in rock music, to only exist in rock music, and if rock music goes away, those values will be lost too. But it's just not true as far as I can see, because each new generation is going to have their own version of what it means to play live and what it means to be authentic. Each genre has its own idea about these things, and rock fails to live up to the standards of other genres just as much as other genres fail to live up to the standards of rock music. And sure, a lot of the immediate sound of rock music may have fallen from the top commercial position. You know, electric guitars, power chords, big solos, riffs, things like that. But those wider generic values of, you know, youth culture, authenticity, do-it-yourself autodidacticism, outsider art, rebelliousness, those things are far bigger than just playing power chords loud on electric guitar through an amp. You're still allowed to prefer rock music or the other genres, of course, and it's obviously one of my favorite genres, but don't pretend that it is a uniquely authentic or real or generally special genre. Although I do think it is definitely worth arguing that what we might call the rock era from, you know, the mid-60s to the mid-90s did see an era where challenging, innovative, and impressive music was uniquely commercially successful across much of the world. Great popular music is still obviously made continually, but I think it's less likely to top the charts today than it was a while ago. So that's my not so immediate reaction, I guess. But is it even actually accurate to say that rock is dead? It's hard to pin down what it means for a genre to die, and I'm sure we could argue over it for ages. Is a genre dead when it stops topping the charts? Is a genre dead when it stops being innovative or original, when it ceases to dominate popular culture, or when literally no one is making new music in that genre anymore? I don't know. I think rock music fits into some of those categories. It's certainly not the dominant popular music in the UK, Europe, and America anymore, and the biggest selling albums each year aren't really what we'd call rock albums. There are still rock bands making rock music every year, and plenty of that is original and innovative, and importantly, still profitable. So I don't think that rock music is dead. It's something. It's less popular than it once was. It's maybe not as innovative as it once was, but that's what happens with decades-old genres, right? It's quite natural. You can't innovate forever within one specific medium. I think there's actually something a little myopic and borderline entitled, I guess, in asking if rock is dead today. Rock music journalists and fans bring up the topic all the time. Rolling Stone magazine has talked about it. Roger Daltrey has. Gene Simmons. It's a popular question on Reddit and Twitter. YouTubers, including myself now, ask the question over and over and over and over and over again. So why do I think it's maybe self-entitled and myopic? Well, because I feel like most people are asking only because it's no longer as big as it once was, as if it should remain culturally dominant for all eternity. But not being as popular as it once was, well, That's not the same as being dead, is it? Not at all. Millions of people still listen to and buy rock albums, old and new. Contemporary rock bands still sell millions across the world and tour successfully. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard are a prime example. Polyphia are huge. Maybe not like, I don't know, Drake or whatever the kids listen to these days. Maybe not Drake huge, maybe not a household name, basically. But they're big enough, right? And I think even more importantly than that, more important than the continued enthusiasm for older rock bands, and more important than the continuing success of contemporary rock bands, more important than the fact that millions of kids across the world are still picking up guitars and are still learning to play rock music even today, is the simple fact that the rock sound, like the DNA of rock music, its vocabulary and its tropes, you know, the stuff I've not actually talked about, that stuff is now an inherent part of all popular music that is definitely not going to go away anytime soon. The rock sound is used aplenty in music we wouldn't necessarily consider rock music. From Steve Vai playing on a Jacob Collier song, to Jack White on a Beyonce tune, to Kanye West and loads of other rap producers and artists sampling rock music. And another good example is the experimental hip-hop band Death Grips, who clearly have a very close relationship with rock, taking bits of their sound from punk and rap rock, and having been acknowledged as an influence on everyone from David Bowie to Kasabian. Now, we could argue that this reduces rock music to little more than a reference or an aesthetic that any band can just briefly wear to seem rock, without truly engaging with the genre. You know, get old Jack White to sing and play guitar in your pop song and it sounds a bit more rock. Maybe capture a bit of that audience, and maybe that is what's happening. Maybe that's exactly what it is, but I don't think that it is, though. I think that the musical landscape just looks very different than it did 20, 30 or 40 years ago. Genres are much less strictly demarcated now than they once were. In part because communities are, well, quite simply less segregated than they once were. Pure rock might not exist like it once did, but does pure hip-hop exist? Pure jazz? What even is generic purity when it comes to it? Anyway, this is all just quite natural. All genres do this and always have, like just forever. Classical guys have been doing cheap imitations of music from other types of music for hundreds of years. And it's just not inherently a problem. And it's not a problem because the only thing that matters is good music, ultimately. But it also just goes to show that the rock sound is still around. It's still appealing, it's still popular, it still sounds cool to a lot of people. And people still understand what they're hearing when they hear it. Because rock music isn't dead. It's just dying. No, I'm kidding. It's just not as popular as it once was. And I really don't think that's a big deal. Its time at the top was never going to last forever. We should all embrace that. Change is good. And if your tastes may be a bit retro or out of sync with a lot of mainstream popular culture, like mine is in many ways, that's also fine. It's just not a big deal. Anyway, I've run out of energy to talk about this now. I've had to chop out loads of stuff that I did want to include, but ultimately I have to keep this semi-watchable and semi-interesting for people. If you have enjoyed these two parts though, please think about subscribing. Thank you for watching. I'm also just going to sneak this in right here at the end. I'm fully aware that there is nothing less rock and roll than what I've just done. A two-parter, hour-long video essay looking at the history, technical elements, theory and culture of rock music. It's super unrock, isn't it? And you know what? I'm okay with that. I don't care what you think. And there's nothing more rock and roll than that. Bye.